contract. I'm going to take off my journalist moderator hat for a second and speak as a citizen, as an African citizen. We had Jennifer Mossae on the last panel, the CEO of the Kampala City Authority. Now, one of the things about that story is I experienced it as a citizen. I saw the city transform as someone who has lived there practically all my life. I saw what the power of an engaged public service can really achieve. And I'll tell you a little story. This happened when a road near my house was paved. I was discussing this with two of my neighbors, and one of my neighbors said, "Oh my goodness, the road was paved. Do you know why they did it?" Now, there's a lot in that question, but there's even more in this answer from my second neighbor. He said, "I think a minister must have moved next door." Now, it's a bit of a tragic example, isn't it? But there is a cognitive dissonance that we must address when it comes to the relationship citizens have with what they see really as the government, the public service providers. We elect officials on the hope that they will improve health, the economy, education, and yet we expect nothing from them in the end. So what is this contract that exists between citizens in Africa and the public service providers who, if we look at it another way, are really the customer service arm of their governments? So I'll introduce my panel. Again, they're all very well known. I won't labor too much. I'll start with Aya Chebbi. She is the founder of the Africa Youth Movement. Of course, you probably all know Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, chair of the board, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, GAVI. Also with us is Akere, sitting at the end, chairman of the International Anti-Corruption Conference Council, and Naidoo. Thank you very much for joining us. He's the founding general secretary of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or as we mostly call it, COSATU. He's also a former minister and a trustee of Earthrise Trust. That's our panel today. And Ngozi, you're sitting, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. You have to choose whether to use your powers of invisibility for good or evil. I'm just joking. Barkha Mossae is also joining us today, and she will be bringing to the table the views from the New Generation Forum yesterday, so she's their representative. Now, Ngozi, if I might start with you, because you've got a very live example of trying to reform this, or trying to engage with this contract between governments and their people. And I'll reference your book, Fighting Corruption is Dangerous. And part of that book, you were talking about what happened when the government was trying to deal with the issue of oil subsidies and the scrapping of them. And you say at some point, it was evident that distrust of the government was high. Can you just explain to us how this aspect, trust for the government, played out in trying to achieve a policy reform?
Well, thank you very much, Nancy. It's good to be here with wonderful colleagues. I think the starting point on the social contract in many of our countries is that it's almost non-existent, in the sense that trust is between the people, government and the people, is so low. But this is a worldwide phenomenon, by the way. If you look at the Edelman Barometer, the recent surveys show that trust in governments globally has fallen to the low 40s. And
so it's not any worse in Africa, is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying it's a phenomenon that people don't trust government anymore. In the US, it's fallen. In Africa, it's fallen. But civil society and business are somewhat more trusted, is in the low 50s in terms of the trust. But general media is among the worst. It's almost similar to government. Media is not trusted. So we're dealing with a situation in our countries and worldwide where there's no trust. And I harp on that because that's what I was getting at. Why was it that people were against removal of subsidies? You know, we're paying almost $13 billion in subsidies, about 5% of GDP of the countries. So large, a fiscal burden. And the idea was if we could phase out some of this and use it to provide services that would actually benefit poorer people, because it's those who have cars and drives that benefit the most. Poor people benefit too, but not to the same extent. So that's what we were trying to do in the government. But because Nigerians feel that they don't get much from their government, they feel that the only thing they get is that subsidy. And they don't trust that the government will use the money, even if they phase it out properly. So there's resistance. So in order for these policies to work, you've got to find a way of rebuilding trust. And the way we did it, we phased out 50%, was to agree that any money that was recovered from the subsidy would be managed in a very open and transparent manner, with somebody with high integrity leading a group that would oversee the use of the resources. And it would go into programs like maternal health, child and infant health, building certain roads and bridges that people could see. People wanted things they could see. And that was the way we got over it, so that we were able to phase out 50%. So trust is a very, very important factor in any social contract. I think it's much more than money. Some people say that we are not spending enough in certain sectors, and that's true. In health, we may not be spending enough. But take education. If you look at the wonderful report that they gave us, you find that Africa, on average, we're spending 16% of our budget, which on education, 16.6, that's the number, compared to 14.1 global average, right? So we're spending above the global average. But if you again look at the report, you'll find that one of the biggest areas of dissatisfaction is with education. People are not pleased with the outcomes and the results they get. So it's not all about money. It's about trying to deliver that service, trying to overcome capacity constraints. I'll come back to that.
Okay. Now, Jay, let me bring you in here, because Ngozi has talked about, trust being a commodity that's necessary across the board. And it's not just governments, media, at which point she looked at me very pointedly. And
we trust you, it's okay.
And all these other sectors. But the contract between citizens and their government, is that not different? Because I can choose whether or not to subscribe to a certain company or a certain media organization. I can't necessarily choose to live in a different country or have a different government.
Well, Nancy, thank you very much. And could I just say, after that inspiring speech by President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson last night, I think we're seeing opening of what I would call the portal of the sacred feminine at the highest level of our continent. And I think this panel reflects it as well. And the strength should continue, not just with the feminine being respected and acknowledged, but also the intergenerational mixture that we have. And I think that, yes, trust is the basis of any contract. Without trust, we cannot have it. We talk a lot, and particularly in relation to my country, of a captured state, but it's not just the state that has been captured. Trade unions have been captured at a leadership level. It's not about the members of trade unions that belong in the public sector. It is about whether those leadership have been using their organizations as a conveyor belt into benefiting from the captured states. So I think trust can only be driven when people believe the message and own the message.
But I think, sorry, just to jump in, but then you're talking about this as a wider concept. Is the public service then just a reflection of what's going on everywhere else?
Yes, I think there is. I think if you're looking at the next generation, and I think people like Aya will be more qualified to talk about that than I am, there's a deep level of alienation with not just governments, with trade unions, with civil society, with business, with our very concept of how we define economy. Is it an economy that we are slaves to it? Is it an economy that serves society, or society serving it? So I think that certainly for me, the biggest challenge of building the Africa we want, we dream of, we pray for, is an acknowledgement that we need a much more participatory process to shape that vision of what Africa is in the future. And that must be to acknowledge and learn to listen. I often say to activists, particularly experienced, professionalized civil society, that the first lesson of building social movements, the first lesson of building democracy from the bottom up, is to learn to shut your mouth and listen to the people.
let's come to you, Aya, because you are an activist, and you were very, very much involved in the struggle to get a new form of government in Tunisia. Do you trust your government?
We're still watchdogging the government, so we continue to do that. I think what we try to do in Tunisia is to build a resilient civil society so that we can continue to watchdog the government. But I really want to touch on the youth and this generation gap. I think for me, the first condition to have a sound social contract is to bridge the generation gap. And I've been hearing today a lot of discussion about youth in every conversation, and I feel we can be trapped in two types of discourses. One discourse could be young people, be responsible, be in charge, take your destiny in your own hands, as if we haven't been protesting since 2011 and changing regimes and trying to occupy the public sector, which was hijacked from us, as if not many thousands, if not millions of initiatives of youth led on accountability, impacting people's life every day that goes unrecognized, and as if our diaspora is not on the top of all the fields, but unfortunately nourishing Western economies and societies because our government let go of them. So that's one type of discourse that we might have the intention that it's empowering, but can be disempowering. The second type of discourse is you're the next generation, you're the leaders of tomorrow. Come back after 1 or 2 decades because we don't have space now. And in the meantime, we need to find solutions for you because now you're a burden, you're the youth bulge, you're the unemployed, you're the violent, and we need to fix it. You're asking for education, you're asking for all these things. So both discourses are disempowering, and it's very rare for me to find people like Jay in influential spaces and African leaders that can say, I'm here to listen to you, I'm here to rally behind your solutions, and I just want you to make use of my experience and to continue my struggle. I think that's an empowering discourse that can put trust and responsibility on us without telling us, be responsible. The second thing I wanted to address is that the reality in Africa today, and Mo Ibrahim Index last year showed that there is 45 years generation gap from the African leadership and the population. And that gap is a gap in understanding 21st century problems and in dealing with them. Yes, we need to be tech savvy because in our movement, we only print our business cards. We are completely digital, and I think the Governance Weekend next year should be totally digital, paper-free. But also, I lead a movement called Africa Youth Movement in 40 countries, and 50% of our work is organizing, training, and connecting African youth across borders online. But beyond technology, I think we need, what we're asking for is to have the decisions that affect the youth. And people who are affected first from service delivery are young people. So how come the youth are not in those spaces to take the decisions for them? The last thing I want to share, which I heard today again, and I hear a lot, is this comparison between the liberation movement and our generation. And it's been 60 years since then. And I am personally fascinated by the liberation movement and the struggle, the political solidarity across borders, and we live by the spirit of Pan-Africanism in our movement. But I think we need to understand the struggle of the 60s is completely different from our generation's struggle. The struggle of the 60s was against colonialism, was rallying around independence. The task they had is to build nation states that we are deconstructing today. But our generation is product of dictatorships. It's product of corrupt systems. And we have one of 3 choices. Either to be part of the public service part of the system that could benefit us and could be corrupt, or go there for the wrong reasons, because 70% in the report shows that youth want to be in public service. Or we decide to change the status quo and change the system from within or from outside. But most of the time, we will end up being crushed. We will end up being threatened.
But do you think
we will end up being abused? And the third choice we have is to choose another system, which could be Daesh, could be dying in the Mediterranean to go to other countries. What I'm trying to say here is that we need to stop homogenizing.
I'm just trying to understand. because we're trying to get a specific perspective from you. What would your choice be, given those options?
I chose to be an activist, but that's not an easy job. I've been arrested, I've been, challenged as a young and as a female, and many, I've been banned, and I've gone through a certain struggle. But what I'm saying is that even if you choose to fight the system, the social contract doesn't really protect you as a citizen. So then you want us to hold you accountable, but then if we stand up and hold you accountable, I can be jailed just by saying something online about accountability. So on the one hand, we need to be really mindful of our discourse of disempowerment, but on the other hand, youth is not a homogeneous group. We need to be talking about which youth are we talking about and what kind of choices they have. I mentioned 3, but another young person can mention different kind of options.
And I think what you say is important in terms of the categories that we place, because when we're talking about youth, are we talking about unemployed youth? It's not only youth that are unemployed. It may be more useful to talk about different categories of people who have no access to power. So let me come to you, Barkha. In your discussions yesterday, what came out about this idea of a contract between public service providers and specifically young people?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you for having me on this panel. And like Aya said, there are like different types of discourses and different options. And I represent a young person in public service. So I've chosen to make public service in Mauritius my calling. So the perspective that I have is completely different. And yesterday, during the discussions that we had at the Next Generation Forum, the first thing that we decided is that we are not the Next Generation Forum, we are the Now Generation Forum, because we are here already. A lot of us are proudly serving in public offices, judiciary, in different ministries, in different roles in the public sector, and we are complemented by activists, by academicians. So it was a wonderful gathering. And after deciding that we are the Now Generation, we also analyze the social contract. What do we understand by the social contract between government, public sector, and the people that we are meant to serve? So what we found is that this contract does not occur in a vacuum. As Africans, we have to take into consideration a whole range of influences. We have our colonial history that we need to take into consideration. We have the history of having been interfered with. We have the influence of multilateral organizations, international frameworks, and now we also have to take into consideration different trends that are happening, whether it's the fourth industrial revolution, where technology is taking the world by storm. So it's not, the social contract is not happening as a vacuum. And in this context, the relationship it's two-way. So I heard a lot about trust, that the trust of people has been eroded. The trust in public sector has been eroded. I honestly think that if public sector was a person, it would be a woman, because it's so easy to keep bashing the public sector. But at the end of the day, when you're bruised, you go back to the public sector. You go back to the healthcare, you go back to the education, and you think of government as being the one to provide for you. At the end of the day, it's government.
But for someone who pays taxes, is that not a legitimate demand?
It is. It is. I will come to the tax issue in a moment. Governments are the ones that open doors, because by nature, it is the role of governments and the public sector to absorb risks. It is our role to pave the way for different sectors of the economy to open. And it is also our role, we have a duty of care towards people. It is not the private sector that's going to decide, hey, this is an interesting sector. Should we test, whether it's going to work or not? It's usually the government that will do the risk assessment, that will try to leverage different rules and different multilateral settings and see, let's try this. And I would also like to refer to something that Mariana said in the previous session, in session number 2, which is that it is thanks to governments and public sector having a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit that we have had so many innovations. And at the end of the day, when we think about this contract, we always want the public sector to innovate. We want the public sector to be modern, to be different, but are we willing to give the public sector the space to be different? Mm-hmm. Are we willing to give public sectors, and here I'm not talking about the public sector as just a nebulous entity. I'm talking about the people who are within public sector, who have a drive to make things happen. Do we want to give those people a chance to experiment in a safe way
and introduce all these things you're talking
so
about?
The trust has to go two ways.
That is an interesting question, because you're talking about very forward-looking challenges, whether it's being modern, being digital, and yet we have very basic challenges like corruption. Yes. If you look at there was some poll results. A poll was done earlier, and one of the biggest challenges that was flagged by the people who responded to that poll was corruption. They said it wasn't financing, it wasn't capacity, it was corruption. So I'll come to you, Akere, because you have a history, like Ngozi, of trying to tame this beast. You can tell us how successful that has been. But in thinking about this contract, how do we move past this very basic issue of just take our money and do what you said you will do with it?
Well, thank you very much, and thank the Mo Ibrahim Foundation for having me. A slight correction firstly, I did resign as chair of the International Anti-Corruption Conference a couple of months ago to do something else. Okay. So you see, not only the Ethiopian Prime Minister resigns, but more seriously, by training I'm a lawyer, and in the contract there are two elements. There's offer and there's acceptance. So what is the public service provider offering? And what should the citizen accept? That's the first thing you have to look at. Secondly, I think Dr. Kaburuka gave us an answer from where I'm sitting, from my experience, is the mindset. The citizen's mindset, which Jay was talking about. The citizens must really raise the demand. If they don't raise the demand, we'll wallow, because we have a funny system in Africa where we think by discussing and having laws, things change. Take the African Union. The same Africans from different states, they think when they go to Addis, they go through some kind of cavalry, and they become different people. But when they get there, they do the same exact things, and nothing changes. So the citizens have to take over by increasing the demand. That's the only way to go. I was listening to OGP, which is fantastic, earlier on. There was a program known as budget tracking. Simply all you did was go to a village that's going to have a bridge. You tell the villagers, in this village, there's going to be a bridge, and this is the cost of the bridge, and this is the budget. And the villagers will watch. Regardless of their party, regardless of their agenda, they want a bridge. Yeah. If it's a well, they will make sure the well is dug. If it's a dispensary, they will make sure it's done. So we have to put the citizens in a position where they can ante the demand for
But some might say even the space to make that demand must be created through leadership. Because leaders must be willing to give that space.
If you her in her position, I have friends at the bar in Tunisia who fought very hard for the revolution, and many other young people. But it gets hijacked. The thing is, we're in a system when you're dealing with what was called era of state capture. Few oligarchs, greedy oligarchs, I should say, who bleed a country dry at the expense of the people. How do you deal with those people? The only way is to make sure that the citizens have information, have access to information. And this is the trick, technology. Somehow, the guys who are doing this, they don't know jack, so to speak, about technology. And that's where you're going to get them. The apps,
until they
information, the tweeting, the Facebook, those guys are scared of that. That's where to get them.
Okay, Ngozi, I'm going to let you jump in.
Yeah, let me just jump in on this. Oh, sorry.
Ngozi, and then...
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Just on that, we need to invest in technology because 70% of the continent is offline. So even if we want to empower citizens with technology, then we need to start investing in technology.
It will take a long time until we hit that critical mass. Ngozi, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, no, I wanted to jump in on the technology, actually, and I really strongly believe in this. I think that two things, technology and information.
Yeah.
Your citizens cannot act unless they have information.
Of course.
And it's in the interest of those who don't want to build this trust to make sure they don't have information. Because once they have it and they know what is happening, then it empowers them. So one of the things that we did when we were in government was this fact that people did not know how much their states, their ministries, and so on got in terms of the budget. So they could easily be told at the state level that, oh, you know, no money came in this month. That's why teachers were not paid. That's why health workers, you know, I remember the first time I was minister from 2003 to 2006, I would visit a state, and people would be so hostile to the Minister of Finance from the federal level. And I started asking why. They say, well, we are not paid, and it's because federal government didn't disburse any money. I'm just taking it down to the practical level of what you have to do. They didn't have any information. They didn't know that we had actually, you know, money had been disbursed to all the states. Our constitution says that money that comes in must be shared in a formula between the federal government and the states. But they were not being paid. Teachers were not being paid. So when this happened a couple of times, it was under President Obasanjo, I asked, could we publish in the newspaper? At that time, we hadn't an app. Could we publish in the newspaper what each state, local government, and the federal government gets each month? And we started publishing this information. And people could see, oh, my state got so many thousands or millions of dollars. My local government got this. Therefore, they were empowered. It was now not possible for the governor or the local government to say we didn't receive any money this month. And people began to challenge because they had that. So we must give them
But let me just ask, because, you know, in this situation, it was fortunate that you had the mind to do this, to take this initiative, to put the information out there. But, you know, how do you do that? How do you replicate that? Can we keep hoping for people like you, or are there institutional ways that we can actually build this capacity that public servants feel accountable to the citizens? So this contract is not based on who administers it.
Well, you know, a way to do that is not to rely on personalities. I think that is the problem we have in our continent. Yes, we talk about leadership, but we're too focused on who is the president, who is the prime minister, you know, who is the finance minister. And I can't leave here without doing my Swiss test. So I'm going to ask people to put up their hands if they know who is the president of Switzerland.
I do, because I've watched your TED Talk.
You have to watch my TED Talk. It's the question I love the most. There are like 3 people in the audience who know who the president of Switzerland is. But if you go, everybody in the world is ready to put their money in Switzerland, send their children to Swiss. Yes, send their children to Swiss finishing school, go on vacation in Switzerland because they believe the country has the rule of law and strong institutions. They don't know who the president is, who is Doris Lettard at this moment. And it's a rotating presidency. We need to get to that. Building of strong institutions. So now we have this technology, and I really want to insist on it to build on what my colleagues have said on the panel. We now have a chance to use all types of technology. Just one example. Again, from our experience. So we have a challenge in Nigeria with regard to corruption. But they're actually part of what I wrote in my book is to give hope that you can actually do something about it. We used biometric systems to get civil servants to begin to you heard earlier, the head of civil service say technology, because it's helping us solve some problems. Before, people could put numbers of people on the payroll, and at the end of the month, when I first became minister, we were transferring cash to ministries and paying. So you give me a payroll, you can put 10 workers there, and people would put what are called ghost workers and collect their money. But by making people register biometrically, you could now pay straight to their accounts. And by weeding out these ghost workers, we weeded out 64,000. We saved $1.1 billion for government. Can you imagine? That's technology. We can multiply so many technology examples that will help us strengthen the public service and give the young people, you know, a chance to innovate. and to use whatever technological tools there are.
Okay. Jay, yes, I'd like you to jump in. And as you jump in, I'd like to add an additional question. Something Barkha mentioned about these systems that have been inherited, because we're talking about institutions here. Many institutions on the continent, you could say, are neo-mercantilist in nature, because they were built on a legacy that was extracting resources and doing the bare minimum to keep the population happy. So talk to us about how to deal with that legacy.
Well, I think that technology is a tool. Social media is a tool. But I haven't seen a country yet run by Twitter or Facebook. So
America.
You haven't seen?
Except
America, yeah.
Touche. So I think there is a struggle and a dialectical tension between the struggles that people like our eminent elders here, or people like Trevor and myself, who come from a 1976 generation, fought and built social movements, built big institutions, built power, and then fought to change the system. And the struggles today that are dominated by the generation of our Chebbis. And that is about leaderless revolutions, because they have been so alienated by what we as a generation have stood for. And it brings me back to the very question, the dilemma that I face today is, we did change the system in South Africa. We did have an iconic leadership, a most progressive constitution. How can we sit here today, and people like Trevor or myself, him leading the civic movement, me in the trade union movement, and say, 24 years later, how could we have betrayed this hope, this dream, this inspiring dream, not just for South Africans, but for Africans and for people struggling for freedom across the world? How could we have betrayed this?
State capture.
But how would people who we would have died for or died alongside betray that and allow our state to be captured?
But
what I do realize is that it's insufficient to talk about just changing the system. That more important is asking, how do we change the human being that's going to be in that system? Otherwise, that system will always be corrupt.
Mindset.
And so that's about purpose. And we discussed on this panel here, what is purpose? What is the meaning of your life? And how do we take that purpose based on integrity, on commitment, on social justice, on the idea that I am here to serve the society rather than serve myself and enrich myself? How do we have a discussion about the values that should permeate the DNA of politics, of business, of civil society, and every single one of us, so that we all become active citizens? And we're not giving our power to some leader. It's so easy to find half a dozen people that can sit on a panel like this and make great speeches or write great constitutions. Paper accepts anything that is written on it. It's only power of people that will make sure that there is accountability. And what we have to do is understand it's not top-down only. It's an interactive process where the bottom-up is in fact more important than the top-down.
Yeah.
But I just need Ngozi to ask a question.
No, I want to ask
Jay
a question, because I believe everything you say. But at the end of the day, you've got to have people. A young colleague here spoke about the difficulty of fighting, the attacks you will get, what you have to go through. So it's nice to have this and to try to change the human being. I think if you want to change the human being, you have to start when they're in grade school, right? So what I'm saying is, right now, where do you find the human beings who are willing to risk themselves to go inside the system to change it? Because she's right. We can't sit here and talk. We have to go in and try to change. But how many people are willing to do that? When it comes down to brass tacks, not many people are willing to leave their cozy and comfortable jobs or situation they're in and go in, because it is too risky.
Well, it was one person, Ngozi, one person who made one speech when I was 15 years old, and it was Steve Biko, that changed my life, not to see public service as a position or a status or a job, but our entire life as public service. And he said one thing: we have nothing to lose but our chains, and that the mind of the oppressed is the main weapon in the hands of the oppressor. That remains with me even today.
I agree.
If I wanted to say something.
It also reminds me of a quote from someone in the US who was involved in the civil rights movement who told me, the power of the people is more powerful than the people in power. But just based on the conversation we had before in the morning around feminism, I think beside talking about people power from bottom-up approach, we need to also look at leadership today. Leadership that values masculinity more than femininity. And we need to start talking about valuing femininity as much as we value masculinity. And the leadership that we have seen today has failed us because it is ego-driven, it is masculine or macho, and it is very much and it's very much competitive, and we're not giving space to female leadership that could be, and I believe is collaborative, is emotionally intelligent, is nourishing instead of destruction, like you mentioned this morning. So I think we only talk about different style of leadership when we are in crisis, but we don't actually look at different types of leadership that we want to explore. So I think it is about bottom up, and it is about leaderless leadership, as we did it in the 21st century revolution, but it is also about the top leadership that needs a different thinking.
Akere, I want you to jump in, because there's something here about, leadership and then about systems. But let me ask you, are people in Africa corrupt more than anywhere else?
No.
Of course. If it's a situation that is about, what is it we need to change here? Is it the systems? Is it the people? What is it?
I think corruption is a systemic problem. But I want to go back to this question about the people and leadership. I think leadership also is important.
Yes.
When I was vice chair of TI, I came to Kigali and had a meeting with the president who is here. And we had a one-on-one meeting. And he told me, Mr. Muna, I cannot guarantee you will eradicate corruption, but I can guarantee you zero tolerance. If you're caught, you will pay the price. And that's what does the trick. The leaders can give the traction. And the problem on a continent is the political will. And that's what we are dealing with. People who will walk the walk, sometimes they won't. They will just talk. And I'm telling you, the mindset, which Donald spoke about this morning, is what we need. And that is what is lacking. And there are certain things that like cash. Cash makes corruption easy. The good example known is, there's an article in Vanity Fair in 2008 known as Billions Over Baghdad, okay? When the provisional administration was in Iraq, over $20 billion in cash was flown in C-130 aircrafts to Baghdad. And all the payments were made in cash by American generals and what have you. And 11 billion was stolen. That's not Africa. So it means that when there is cash hanging around, the propensity, in my country, you can go to a bank and you write a check, and when the guy is paying you, he looks at you as if you have to give him a tip, okay? I mean, that is it. But if you go to a teller machine with your card, you stick it in, you take out your money.
So you can fix that problem without necessarily having to change any values. You can fix a problem like that, like you're describing, by changing the system without necessarily having to change the values.
I'm saying it's the environment. You asked me the question, are we more corrupt than the rest? I said, no, it's the environment at times. And the relation we have with cash as well. So I'm saying, if we go through electronic payments and stuff like that, maybe things will get easier. She just told you about the fact that they would transfer your salary to the bank. So I think there are new tools that can permit us to fight against it. In my country, we just started, they went to a big training for e-procurement. It was done by the South Koreans. 2 years, it's in place. Not a single tender has done through e-procurement.
Wow.
Exactly, wow. So that's it, leadership is important. It gives traction to the system. If you don't have that, as she said, you can scream all you want, we'll be on the same spot.
If I may jump in.
I do need to open it up, but I'll let you jump in as you answer.
So I will quickly, it's just on the question of leadership, which is, maybe it's because I'm an islander from Mauritius that I'm very optimistic about Africa. And I think a lot of the debate here has been about the failings of Africa and the failings of the public service. But I just wanted to issue a challenge. I wanted to know how many people here in the room are public servants or in a position of authority in a ministry or in public service. If I could just have a quick show of hands. So very quickly, what would really matter if we're talking about leadership and the leadership discourse? I think leadership is about creating space for others to be leaders. And if we want to change how public service delivers to people, if we want to change the narrative around corruption, around whether young people are included or not, everyone here who is in public service, maybe when you go back to your workplace, have a look at the young person who's sitting at their desk who just needs that one validation, one click, one opportunity to prove an idea and to engage with people outside. So maybe this is how we start organically from here, from the Governance Weekend.
Those spaces.
So it's not for something that people outside of the Governance Weekend will do. We are here. We're going to start it now.
Sure, it starts from within. Okay, what we're going to do is we'll take, I know there'll be statements as well as questions. So let's do it this way. 2 quick statements, 3 questions, and then we'll have to wrap it up. So if there are any hands, they're on. Oh, there's one over there. Okay, let's just quickly take your statement or question. Let us know if it is a statement or a question, and then go ahead with it.
It's a statement. My name is Julie Mutunga from Kenya. I represent the African Association for Public Administration and Management. And for this discourse, I humbly put to you the African Charter on Public Service Values, the African Union Charter on Public Service and Values. And this document is a very important and useful document in shaping the discourse of public administration and how public administrators conduct themselves. So I submit to you this document. It hasn't been ratified by a lot of African countries, but I just would like to reinforce that.
Okay, thank you. And of course, I'm sure many people will be remembering that it's in the implementation, right? On paper, we've got great policies. It's always the implementation. Okay, we've got room for 1 more statement and 2 questions. There's a hand over there. Yes, tell us if it's a statement or a question.
It's a question.
Thank you.
So my name is Nasu Fofana. I'm from Sierra Leone. I think we're talking about public service, and there is really two very important institutions who are supposed to be present in this room who really influence public service in Africa. That's the traditional institutions. So, for example, in Sierra Leone, the institution of Paramount Chieftaincy and the Interreligious Council. These people really impact how our public service works. And not having them in this room, I think we're missing a very, very important piece of what we're talking about.
Okay. We've got room for 1 statement, 1 question. Anything on this side of the room? We haven't been here yet.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omoniko Yoma Brown from Nigeria. I'm a lawyer, and I work with a company called Schlumberger in the private sector. So, Mike, I've listened to thank you for the very interesting arguments and comments. I've listened to both sides, talking about building strong institutions, talking about leadership, talking about the movements against leaders that are not performing properly in power. So when you have leaders that are not working, and you have these movements like civil society, street unions questioning, and the leaders are not ready to change, the civil society movements are not making any headway, the people are not being listened to, where do we go from there? Like, what are the options when nothing seems to work?
Okay, thank you. And one last one. There's a hand over there, standing.
Making it easier on you to choose. Hamdi Osman. Question to Aya. Aya, for your generations, the generation now, what would you need from us as civilians to help you guys? And for Jay, we love your comment. Keep it going. We need the wisdom in Africa, and you guys part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's address those quick points. Nasu had this point about traditional institutions, and perhaps that's related to this legacy, this structure that we've inherited that doesn't quite acknowledge pre-existing structures, you know, whether they're cultural or otherwise. Jay, do you want to take that one? And then also answer the question, well, it was a compliment, so that's fine, just that.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point of view because there's an assumption here that we have no history, that there was no governance before the last 500 years where we've lived under the shadow of slavery, colonization, apartheid, the most brutal form of exploitation. There was governance. There was tremendous governance. You look at the kingdoms, the Monomotapa, the Benin kingdoms, you look at the Egyptians, the Sudanese. I mean, these were great civilizations that held governance, that held a sacred container where community, society cooperated and had a shared vision of how this continent would grow that was completely destroyed. And now when we're looking at systems and architecture of governance, we are looking at becoming poor photocopies of things that have been imposed on us. So I think the idea of a return to indigenous wisdom, indigenous knowledge, understanding those deep traditions which respected women, which respected our environment, which respected that we are more than just these physical bodies that we have decided to inhabit, would be a tremendous bonus towards us shaping the type of governance in the future that works. The last point I want to make is stop looking for a messiah. You know, stop. In South Africa, we don't need another Mandela. We need to find that Mandela within ourselves, 55 million South Africans. And I think that what we need, and what I learned from what President Kagame represents to me, is zero tolerance. If you are employed to do a job, do your job. Otherwise, as a trade unionist, I would say you should be fired. If you steal money, you should go to jail. That is what we need as the predictability across Africa. And I think that's really important. And lastly, it's don't put our faith in individuals. Don't give our power away to leaders or to the old generation. Power should be shared. And it is that sacred balance between the power, between generations, between genders, between those that have something and those that have nothing. It is that sacred balance that we need to restore back in Africa. And that is going back to having the pride to respect that we are Africans who have a history long before the history of systems that had been attempted to be imposed on us today.
Wow. Powerful. We then had that question about what do you do when all the options we know of, whether it's leaders, civil society, aren't working? Who would like to take that? Ngozi?
Why are you giving me the impossible questions?
Because you have done impossible things.
Oh. You know, well, I believe so much in action from citizens. I have to tell you, I want to get back to that because some of the things that were talked about by Sanjay when he was being interviewed by Mo, by what Jay and Akere and all of us are saying, boils down to let's not give our power away. Let's realize that we have power. Let's get information. So when, I think there's nothing, nobody's going to solve that problem for you. There's no one going to descend. Like Jay was saying, there's no Messiah coming. So it has to be within you. If civil society is protesting and it's not going anywhere, you intensify. You just believe in yourselves. Look at what just happened in Armenia. You know, I'm not here advocating any revolution anywhere. That's not what I'm saying. But maybe I am. You know, because I've gotten to the point where I think in some of our countries, we really need it. You know, so I'm saying in answer to that question, no one can change and solve our problems for us except ourselves.
Of course, yes.
Others can come and help. There's no donor. World Bank, IMF, DFID, no one will do it. US, you have to just decide to be brave And that's what I was trying to say. You know, the human being is risk averse. And I'm not knocking it. When you take risks, sometimes you pay a heavy price. But we have to take those risks if we want to change things. So that's my answer. Keep pushing with civil society. Keep making your point. Refuse to give up. You know, if you have a chance at the ballot box, go to the ballot box because that's the most, but go wisely. Someone said it's not about elections, it's about changing the system. But civil society can do a lot.
Fantastic. I'll come to you, Aya. There was a question there about what would help. Earlier in the day, you told me as a youth you were frustrated. What would ease that frustration?
Just before that, to go on the, when the system is not working and when the people are pushing, I think always it would reach a tipping point where change will happen. And that's what happened in Tunisia, because many people think the revolution happened overnight between 2010 and 2011, but we had so many mini revolutions since 2006. And when it reached that tipping point, then change happened. And probably Tunisia now is probably one of the ones making its way to democracy because we were ready for that revolution and we were building up to it. For the question on what you should do, I think our struggle as young people is a struggle for voice. I think our political voice needs to be protected, but we need you to listen. We need you to talk to us, not about us. We need you to believe that young people are the drivers of development, not the subject of it. And we need to be in leadership positions. We say all the time we want to be in leadership positions, and some of the response would be, then go and you know, take it. But as you said, you need to create spaces for that. We have been trying to take it peacefully. So I think if we want to support youth movements and youth to be in leadership position, we need to open up the space and not push them to the limit, to use other means to do that. And then the last thing I want to say is about citizen participation and civil society. I think the most powerful source of participation and accountability is civil society. From the experience of Tunisia, it was not the Tunisian government who won the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2014, it was the Tunisian civil society. It was given to Tunisian civil society because at the edge of the crisis, it was the labor union, it was the youth movement, it was the lawyer association, it was, you know, different groups and collectives that came together to mediate the crisis. Right. And I think in the accountability question, civil society can play a huge role in that, and it is playing that role, filling the gap and mediating. And just want to mention one really good example from Tunisia, very briefly. It's called Fix Qarawaan, and it's just a group of youth who started this initiative in a small city in the north of Tunisia, where they started a platform to bring together citizens and the municipality. And they started opening a mechanism of participatory budget, starting a conversation. The citizens signed and wrote a citizen pact together with the municipality. There is here Raptel, who wrote a children's book called Barkha, and it's hey, Raptel, and her book became a policy at the national level taught in schools. So many of the civil society initiatives from their place as activists, as artists, as media collectives, as advocacy groups can start something that can turn into policy. And I think that's where our contribution comes in. So many young people should be in public service, but many of them should be activists and continue to do that.
Just a quick word that young people in public service can also be activists and try to change the system from within.
I agree.
Good to have both. I think I'll end by putting you on the spot, Akere, because you are running for president.
Am I?
Yeah. Well, I'm telling you now. I'm making the announcement for you. No, you have officially put in a bid. But my question would be, often these conversations seem so far removed from what happens on the other side. Mm-hmm. And the people who sit on this side often seem so different from the people who end up sitting on the other side. So if you were to be president, what would you do differently based on this conversation we've had?
I think it's only one question you ask. I think every leader should ask one question. Every time he applies a policy, he should ask, how does it benefit the people? I think that's the easy answer.
That seems fairly obvious.
Yeah, that's it. You know, I think that's what it is. And do they ask that question? how does it benefit my people? If you can't answer that, you should resign, I think. And that's the problem we have. And just to tell you, if you want to see the level of corruption in your country, look at the exams. If you go in a country and the line to be a customs officer is long, the line to be a tax collector is long, the line to be a police officer is long, then you know something is wrong.
I think that's a perfect point to end on, and tweet, if it's long, it's wrong. So thank you for that. We started this discussion talking about public service, but I think we've really ended up talking about ourselves as citizens. And the fact that public service is us, it belongs to us. We need to make the demands. We need to follow through and also, of course, support in whatever way we can. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Great moderation.
And please thank my amazing panel.
Well done. My voice?
You must.
Thank you very much.